Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to talk more about using old movie projectors in our sewing rooms so we can project patterns directly onto our cutting mats and start cutting right away, no longer needing paper patterns. Today I want to show you how I made this cute Chore jacket using my projector, some fabric I got at the Goodwill bins, and a free pattern from the internet. Let's get to it.
So the free PDF pattern I'm using is called the Paola workwear jacket, and the fabric I'm using is from the Goodwill bins. One piece is a really dark blue, almost black color, and the other is a medium dark navy. First, I needed to cut the fabric into squares and sew them all together. But to figure out how many squares I would need for each pattern piece, I turned to my projector. Now, if you're curious about the technical logistics of how I even got this pattern to project, I'll drop a link in the description to a video I already made that explains all of that, including how to make sure you're projecting an accurate size and how to turn a PDF pattern into a projector pattern. But the short explanation is that I'm using an amazing free site called patternprojector.com that makes all of that really easy to do. Anyways, I displayed each pattern piece on my cutting mat and laid out some sample squares I made to get an estimate. For the 02 size, I estimated that I'd need to cut 154 of these 4.5-inch squares, so I got cranking. First, I made these long strips and then cut the strips into squares using my clear ruler and cutting mat as a guide to make sure all the squares were 4.5 inches. You'll also notice I'm using these magnets to hold the fabric in place when I cut, which I'll talk more about later. I played around with some patchwork pattern options and decided on this alternating layout of the squares using the reverse side of the medium dark navy as a third color, because I had more of that fabric than the other one. Then I got cranking on serging all of those squares together, one row at a time. Now, if you choose to make your own patchwork fabric like this, I do have a couple quick tips for you. After you've created rows, you'll want to press the seams of each row in opposite directions. That way, your sewing machine will only have to sew through 4 layers of fabric instead of 6. Then, when you're ready to sew them together, make sure to place your pins at every connecting point. And because you've pressed the seams in opposite directions, you've essentially created these little joints, kind of like tongue and groove floors, I guess. It helps make sure that your square corners will be perfectly connected and matched, which is so satisfying. So here are the patchwork panels I'll use for the back, front, and 2 sleeves. And now it's time to start cutting the pattern with the help of my projector. I cut out each piece using my rotary cutter and DIY magnetic cutting mat, which I have to say has been a game changer when it comes to projector sewing. I basically just bought a piece of sheet metal from Home Depot and put it under my cutting mat. And then I use these 60 and 100-pound weight magnets on my pattern pieces to help keep the fabric in place. It also helps keep the fabric flat, which is important because when it's not, it can cause the projected lines to warp and become inaccurate. So first I cut the sleeves, and you'll notice I'm using my clear ruler again for parts of the pattern that have straight edges. Then press down a little to make sure the fabric is flat, and then cut right on top of that projected line. Once I was done cutting the sleeves, I went back to my computer to click and drag the pattern to display the next pattern piece I wanted to cut. So next I cut the back piece, which you're supposed to cut on the fold, and then placed my magnets and started cutting. I put a little extra magnetic reinforcement near the neckline, which I learned to do for areas that have stronger curves to help hold the fabric in place while I turn my rotary cutter. Then I cut the front pieces. I cut the first panel out, then I went back to my computer and flipped the pattern vertically to get the image to display in reverse. I could have just flipped my fabric, but I wanted to point out one of the many tools that this pattern projector site has. It also gives the option to make the projected lines thicker from 0 to 5 points. And don't forget to cut any notches if the pattern calls for them. They can be hard to see and I missed them at first, so I went back and added them later. Then I used some plain fabric scraps to cut the top and bottom collar pieces and the facing. Now you'll notice I'm not cutting out the pockets the pattern calls for because I plan to create invisible ones along the side seams later. Now I can turn off my projector and move on to the interfacing. This pattern calls for interfacing on the undercollar piece and the facing. So I use this type of iron-on fusible interfacing that has a bumpy texture on one side and a smooth texture on the other. You want the bumpy texture against the wrong side of the fabric because the bumpy part is like a glue that will stick to your fabric when ironed. So I cut out all the interfacing I needed using the already cut pattern pieces as a guide, but you could use your projector too. Then I ironed them on. Now it's time to sew everything together. The pattern instructions say to use flat felled seams to finish the edges on the shoulders, sides, and sleeves, but that didn't seem possible with this patchwork fabric. Instead, you'll see that I join my seams with my regular sewing machine and then finish my seams with my serger, adding a top stitch on those parts to give the same finished look. If you don't have a serger, you could also use a zigzag stitch on your regular sewing machine. So I started by pinning the back and front pieces at the shoulder and then sewed across, leaving a 5/8 inch seam allowance, then finished the edges with my serger. Then pressed the seam allowance towards the back piece and then top stitched a 1/4 inch from the stitching I just did. And here's what that top stitch looks like when it's finished. Then I pinned and sewed the front and back facing pieces together, leaving a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then I pressed those seams open and serged all the way around the outer edge of the facing. From here, I pinned the collar pieces together and sewed the outer edges with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then I trimmed the seam allowance and snipped the outer corners to help make them less bulky when flipping them inside out. And I use this darling brass vintage receipts holder to help poke out the corners. Then I gave it a good press and top stitched a 1/4 inch along the outer edge. Then I got to what I thought was the hardest part. So I pinned the collar at the center and made sure my back notches lined up with the edge of the collar, then pinned the facing on top of that, which sandwiched the collar in the middle. I then continued pinning along the rest of both sides of the facing. Finally, I sewed all the way around from one front panel to the neckline to the other panel using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then I gave the seam allowance and corners a trim, added some clips across the neckline and flipped it inside out, poking out those top corners. I gave the new seams a good press and top stitched all the way around the front panels and neckline with that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then I pinned the inner facing to the jacket all the way around and sewed it down right next to that serged edge. For the sleeves, I pinned them to the jacket body and sewed the top part on at the shoulder, leaving a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And then serged the seam and ironed it toward the jacket. And I added another one of those 1/4 inch top stitches. Then I pinned the rest of the sleeve together along the side of the bodice and sewed that all together using a 5/8 inch seam allowance. I locked that in with my serger, then pressed the seam toward the back of the jacket and added another 1/4 inch top stitch. It was tough to get the top stitch all the way through the sleeve, so I went as far as I could and finished the top stitch by sewing up the other side of the sleeve through the hole, which I definitely broke a needle or two at this part. To hem the sleeves, I tried the jacket on and measured to around my knuckles, and then I serged the raw edge of the sleeve, which wasn't really necessary because I ended up tucking it into the fold of the hem, and then pinned everything in place and sewed across along the fold with about 1 inch, give or take, seam allowance. And then I did the same thing to the hem, making sure it perfectly ended at that last row of squares. Sewed across with about the same inch seam allowance. And then it was time for the finishing touches. So I marked the spots on my jacket I wanted the snaps, created holes in both sides using my snap press, then added all the front and back snap pieces. For pockets, I seam ripped these 2 side squares and made 4 pocket shapes and serged all the edges of the individual pieces. Then I sewed each one to the inside seams and then sewed the pockets shut all the way around. And then finally, I redid that top stitch that I seam ripped, and without further ado, I present the finished jacket. This was a true labor of love and patience, particularly with making and sewing all those squares together. But I am so thrilled with how it turned out. It's giving some solid 70s hippie vibes. As far as the fit goes, I'd say the pattern is pretty true to size if you're going for an oversized look, which I think is perfect for this style of jacket. If I didn't have to make and sew all the squares, I think I could have easily sewn this pattern at a leisurely pace over a weekend. So that's it. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this video helpful in any way, please subscribe to my channel and let me know in the comments if you have any questions about using a projector for sewing or my process for making this jacket. Thanks so much for watching. Bye!